Good evening, travelers of the thin places. Thanks for joining us. I'm Alex, and welcome to the third pilot episode of Hidden History Radio. I was going to dive into the whole topic of Malaysia Flight 370 today, but there's been a topic all over my feed that I think needs talked about. So let's just dive right in. Some landscapes don't just hold stories, they keep score. We're going to step onto one of those landscapes, a fenced rectangle of high desert in northeastern Utah, where the sagebrush rattles like teeth and the sky feels too big to be empty. You know the name by now, Skinwalker Ranch. From the county road, it's ordinary, rusted wire, scrub, red stone shouldering a horizon that looks like it's been holding its breath for 1,000 years. But ask around after dark, very quietly, and you'll hear the same careful phrasing from ranchers, linemen, tribal elders, forest guys who don't scare easy. That place. Not a ranch, not a meadow, that place. The one where engines cough for no reason, radios hiss with voices you didn't key, and dogs decide, absolutely, resolutely, not to cross a certain line in the dirt. Before there were fences, before a deed ever got stamped with a human name, this was Ute country, and pieces of it were marked in a way no surveyor could record. Places you don't sleep, places you don't call by name. Ask an elder, and they'll tell you with a small shake of the head, not superstition, etiquette. There's a difference. Etiquette means you've learned how to live beside something that will never belong to you. You'll also hear a Navajo word passed around by outsiders who only half understand it, Yi Naldlushi, skinwalker. It gets translated as witch or shapeshifter, but those words are like paper masks for something made of bone and hunger. In the old teachings, a skinwalker isn't a creature you chase with a camera. It's a person who's broken a covenant, traded kinship for power, and now lives between forms. It can borrow your voice, it can wear your outline, and if you invite it by paying it too much attention, by saying the wrong thing, the wrong way, at the wrong time, it will step through. Now, I'm not here to dress legend up as news. We'll get to documents and budgets and classified acronyms, I promise. But you need to hear the ground first, because the ground is where this story keeps circling back. Turn the calendar to the late 1800s. Settlers come in with cedar fence posts and hard knuckles, and they hear the tribal warnings and shrug. Winter's coming, cattle need grazing. Stories don't stack hay. They hammer and dig and haul water. Some make it. Some leave quietly. A few leave fast. We have little threads of testimony, handed down, scribbled on brittle paper, repeated in kitchens where the lights stay on past midnight. A ranch hand in 1905 notes embers rising from the earth at the far swale, like coals under a crust. A week later, the handwriting goes tight. The dogs will not leave the cellar. And then the journal ends mid-sentence, a line that just trails off like a radio drifting out of range. No last page, no tidy goodbyes, just silence, which out there is its own kind of punctuation. By the 1930s and 40s, you hear oddities whispered over party lines, old farmers remembering blue foxfire over the fields after a dry lightning storm, someone's mare refusing to step past a spot where the soil looks no different at all. In the 60s, a schoolteacher driving home late watches two white lights pace her car from the mesa lip to the cottonwoods, winking in and out like something learning how to breathe. She never files a report. She turns up the radio and tells herself she's tired. That's a theme too, no report. Because out there, your reputation pays the mortgage, and reputations don't survive flying saucers. So the land collects these little denials, like IOUS stuffed in a drawer you never open. And then you hit the 1990s, and the drawer won't close anymore. But listen, before we get to modern names and money and people who arrive with clipboards and leave with migraines, I want you to picture the topography, because it matters. Imagine a shallow basin, ringed by low ridges and a broad, blunt mesa to the south like a red knuckle. Imagine a creek that isn't much in August and tries to be a river in April. Imagine old irrigation ditches that run straight as rules until they don't, because something under the soil buckled long before anyone drew lines here. Now, Overlay that with boundaries you can't see, places where compasses twitch, where sheep go wide for no sane reason, where the wind sounds like a breath behind you when you know you're alone. People who live near the property will talk about sound first, not light. They'll say there's a hum, not the power line buzz you can put your hand on, not a diesel idle from the highway, lower, older, like a cello string somebody plucks down under the dirt every so often, 8 seconds apart. Some swear 8 beats between the pulses, like a heartbeat, a lineman told me, and then laughed like he'd told a joke that wasn't funny. And there's smell too, ozone on a clear night, hot metal in winter when the air should be empty. Little phenomena that add up to your being noticed. Even if nothing happens, you feel catalogued. I've had a few old-timers say the same phrase in different kitchens at different tables, years apart. That valley knows your name. And every time they say it, they don't look at me. They look at the door, like they're checking it's still closed. Now the easy thing, the comfortable thing, is to say folklore seeds the mind plants the experience, and the experience feeds the folklore. Close the loop, done, and sometimes that is the loop. But we're going to set that tidy circle next to something messier tonight. Measurements that fail when you most need them, budgets that show up where they shouldn't, and professionals who arrive as skeptics and leave with burned-out drives and nosebleeds that stop the same day they cross the county line. When the intangible starts leaving scorch marks, you at least have to squint at it. So, file away the etiquette of the place. Don't call it by name unless you mean to invite it closer. Don't whistle after midnight. Don't dig just because you're curious. Those aren't superstitions here, they're procedures. People follow procedures when procedures keep them alive. And while we're tacking notes to our board, pin this one with a red thread. This story isn't just about the sky. Yes, lights will come. Yes, shapes that don't fly, like planes, will make an appearance. But the veteran watchers out there will tell you the same truth in a dozen ways. It's under the ground. Whatever the sky is doing, the ground hums first. That's where instruments go blind. That's where batteries drain. That's where calm animals turn mean all at once and then act like nothing happened. In a few minutes, we'll roll forward to the 90s and meet a practical ranch family who bought cheap acreage and walked into a pressure system nobody could see. The wolf that doesn't bleed, the tools that vanish and reappear stacked neatly on a roof no one could reach without a ladder that wasn't there. The gates ripped clean off hinges with no pry marks, like something lifted them sideways. We'll get to the blue orbs and the scalpel-clean cattle deaths, and the night the cameras froze as if a hand pressed the pause button without a hand. But for this first stretch together, breathe with the land, feel how the story wants to be told from the dirt up. If you start with lights, you'll chase lights. If you start with ground, your compass points at the thing the lights are trying to keep you from noticing. You hear that? That's the pulse I was talking about. 8 seconds between the notes, give or take. Some folks swear it's geology, some say it's a machine. A few, only when they're tired, admit it feels like a warning knock. We'll test that idea later against the logs and timelines and the moment Washington quietly slid money into a line item that technically did not exist. For now, mark the map in your head. Ute boundaries, Navajo cautions, settler diaries with torn-off endings, a mesa like a knuckle, a creak like a fuse, and a hum that keeps time for something that would prefer you didn't keep time on it. When we come back, it's 1994. A family hangs extra locks because the house came with them, meets a wolf that shrugs off bullets, and learns the first rule of that valley. The moment you measure it, it measures you back. Stay with me. When the Shermans bought the property in 1994, they weren't chasing mysteries, they were chasing acreage and grass for cattle, hard-working, early-rising people. They'd built ranches before. They thought this place would be just another long stretch of sweat and weather. For the first few weeks, everything looked fine, except for the locks. Heavy steel deadbolts on every door, chains on the windows, even padlocks on the cabinets. Terry laughed about it at first, figured the previous owner was the nervous type. but he left the locks in place. Then the wolf happened. It wasn't a story told later. It was day one. A wolf the size of a small pony came trotting out of the willows, calm as you please, tail swaying. It let them get close. It smelled like wet dog and dust. Then it turned, clamped its jaws around the throat of a calf, and refused to let go. Terry fired a .357 Magnum into its side. Nothing. He fired again. Chunks of fur and flesh tore loose, and the animal didn't bleed. It just looked at him, stepped backward, and loped away toward the river. The tracks went half a mile, clear as prints in fresh clay, and then stopped. No fade, no turn, just stopped. That was the moment the Shermans realized something on that ranch didn't care about bullets, physics, or explanations. From that spring forward, their life turned inside out. Tools disappeared from workbenches and reappeared later, stacked in impossible places, on top of fence posts, balanced on barn rafters. A half-ton feed chain vanished from the truck bed and was later found coiled like a snake in a tree. At night, they started seeing lights, blue spheres the size of baseballs drifting silently across the fields, orange globes that rose from the ground and shot straight up into the clouds, and smaller points that danced like fireflies made of metal. Then came the livestock mutilations. Over the next 2 years, they lost 14 cattle, each death stranger than the last, eyes removed with surgical precision, no blood on the ground, flesh cut so clean the vet said it looked like laser work. Predators don't cauterize wounds, but these were cauterized. Neighbors offered theories, cultists, government tests, radiation, aliens. The Shermans just wanted to survive. They called the sheriff. The sheriff shrugged. He'd heard versions of this before. Then they called the press. That's how the stories reached billionaire Robert Bigelow, a man already obsessed with the question of what hides behind reality's curtain. Within months, he offered to buy the ranch outright. The Shermans agreed. They wanted out. Bigelow didn't move in with superstition, he moved in with instruments. He formed a research group called the National Institute for Discovery Science. Scientists, engineers, security staff, and a few ex-intelligence hands. They set up trailers and communication towers, cameras, radiation meters, seismographs, magnetic sensors, even chemical samplers for the soil and air. At first, the setup went flawlessly, but as soon as the full grid powered on, the electronics began to fail. Batteries drained in seconds, laptops crashed, memory cards wiped themselves clean. Every time the team replaced equipment, it died again the moment they pointed it toward the hot zones, especially near the southern mesa. In the logs, you see the first repeated pattern: 8-second energy surges, pulses coming from beneath the ground, perfectly timed, every 8 seconds like a heartbeat. They tried to trace it. They tried to dig. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, like standing too close to a storm. One night, the sensors spiked so high they thought the system was malfunctioning. The crew outside felt the vibration under their boots, steady, smooth, as if something mechanical were turning below the dirt. Then the ground trembled once and went still. The readings dropped to 0. A week later, the same pattern returned, only stronger. When they reviewed the camera feeds, the frames during the surge were blank, every single one. A security guard on patrol reported seeing a dark object hovering above the western ridge. No sound, no lights. When the main cameras turned toward it, the video froze for 3 seconds and resumed on empty sky. The next morning, 3 circular impressions 12 feet across were discovered in the soil. The grass inside each ring was brittle, baked. Soil samples came back showing exposure to intense microwave radiation. The scientists called it a directed energy anomaly. Privately, they called it the knock, because just before a camera died, you could hear a single, hollow tap on the metal casing, as if something were letting them know they'd been noticed. They tried everything: shielding, isolation, fresh cables, different frequencies. Nothing held. The closer they looked, the less their instruments worked. It was as if observation itself triggered resistance. Even so, the team logged months of data: magnetic field inversions, infrared signatures without visible sources, columns of light that rose straight from the ground into the night sky. When they mapped the readings, the lines formed geometric shapes, triangles, circles, repeating patterns that seemed to shift with human movement. One physicist wrote in his notes, "Environment appears to respond to observer presence." He didn't publish that sentence anywhere. After 2 years of research, the results were inconclusive. They had evidence of something, but not enough to name it. Bigelow's investors were restless. Journalists kept calling. Then came a quiet visitor from Washington, D.C., an intelligence liaison who asked for a briefing on what the team had found. Within months, word reached Senator Harry Reid. He'd long been interested in aerial phenomena. He called it potential national security concern and pushed for funding. Out of that conversation came the Advanced Aerospace Weapon Systems Applications Program, AAWSAP for short, a black-budget project that officially studied future aerospace threats. Unofficially, part of that money went straight to Bigelow's research at Skinwalker Ranch, $22 million for cattle mutilations, light orbs, and a pulse in the dirt. Government analysts reviewed the data and recognized the same 8-second oscillation in radar logs from naval incidents, objects over the Pacific moving faster than physics should allow. The pattern matched. Whatever haunted the ranch might also be roaming the sky. They wrote reports using cautious language: anomalous biological entities, trans-medium craft, directed energy signatures. No one used the word alien. But off the record, a technician admitted, "The readings act like they're aware of us." That was enough to keep the funding quiet and flowing. By 1999, the ranch had become a fortress: tall fences, motion lights, armed guards. Locals joked that the place had gone full X-Files, but curiosity in the basin only grew. Truckers passing the property saw lights rise vertically from the ground. Pilots logged radar blips that appeared and vanished mid-air. Residents miles away reported animals acting strange, engines dying, the smell of ozone drifting across their porches at night. And yet, through all of it, the official line remained: nothing to see, nothing proven, nothing to explain. But the files existed, the money existed, the instruments kept dying, and beneath it all, that steady pulse, 8 seconds on, 8 seconds off, beat like something under a blanket, waiting. After Bigelow's team had spent years watching batteries die and cameras go blind, the government wanted a closer look. They never said why, of course. They never do. But sometime around 2007, a small note began appearing in defense spreadsheets, a new line under Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification. A few months later, another line appeared, this time under something called AAWSAP. If you followed the money, it led right back to Las Vegas, to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, a company that didn't build rockets so much as it built explanations for what rockets sometimes ran into: $22 million in funding. Not a huge sum for the Pentagon, but enough to build a curtain. Behind that curtain, engineers and analysts started comparing notes from 2 very different arenas. One, the Red Valley of Utah; the other, radar tracks of unidentified craft recorded by the Navy. Different places, same rhythm, the same 8-second pulse. In Washington, they called the project a materials study. In Utah, the scientists called it a haunting with data points. Internal memos described anomalous biological entities. That phrase sounds clinical, but it hints at something alive, or behaving as though it's alive. Reports listed symptoms in field personnel: nausea, fatigue, anxiety, unexplained burns, nightmares shared across teams. At Los Alamos, a classified sub-study began cross-referencing radiation data from the ranch with readings taken near weapons test vaults. Someone noticed that when certain isotopes decayed underground, they produced microbursts of gamma radiation almost identical to what the Skinwalker sensors had logged. Coincidence, or evidence that the same kind of energy, the same pulse, was being generated deliberately somewhere else? Meanwhile, a second site entered the whispers: Dugway Proving Ground, about 100 miles southwest of the ranch. Officially, Dugway tests biological and chemical defenses. Unofficially, it's where things vanish from radar on purpose. Truckers hauling supplies through the area talk about sudden radio silence, compasses spinning, headlights dimming for exactly 8 seconds before returning to normal. Farmers nearby see lights that rise out of the desert floor, straight columns, not aircraft. And geologists who've mapped magnetic anomalies through Utah's crust notice something impossible: a filament of distorted field running from Dugway northeast straight towards Skinwalker Ranch, as if the two sites share a buried artery. One retired base engineer once said, off record, "Whatever's happening out there, we built next door to it." By 2010, the paperwork trail looked almost mundane: contracts, grants, technical evaluations. But inside the language were little cracks: references to transmedium craft, cognitive influence effects, energetic footprint correlation. The analysts writing those lines were trained to strip emotion from their words, yet every so often you could feel unease in the phrasing, like static under a phone call. Then came a report labeled DARD 2010-019, Detection and Track of Anomalous Aerial Phenomena. Buried in its appendix was a chart comparing the ranch's magnetic field inversions with radar data from the Nimitz Tic Tac encounter off California's coast. The waveform match was nearly perfect. That's the first time anyone in uniform admitted, even in a footnote, that the mystery in the desert might reach the ocean. Still, skepticism had its champions. The Pentagon closed AAWSAP publicly in 2012, saying nothing of consequence had been learned. Privately, fragments of the project splintered into smaller, renamed programs. The public never noticed. The budgets were too small to stand out, the language too vague to raise alarms. But in Utah, the work never really stopped. Sensors stayed live. Guards stayed on payroll. Bigelow's team kept hearing the hum, measuring the surges, filing reports no one outside the circle would ever read. And then quietly, Bigelow pulled out. He'd proven something, maybe only to himself, and he was done. In 2016, the ranch sold again. The buyer's name was hidden behind a shell company, Adamantium Real Estate. Later, it came out that the man signing the checks was a Utah entrepreneur named Brandon Fugel. Fugel claimed he was a skeptic. He said he wanted to run youth camps on the property, open the place up, bring in proper science. But before the ink on the deed was dry, the phenomena resumed, almost as if it had been waiting for new observers. When Fugel's team arrived, they brought hardware the old scientists could only dream of: hardened servers, quantum magnetometers, drones, laser-range LiDAR, weather balloons rigged with multi-spectrum cameras, everything networked, everything redundant. And once again the pattern repeated: equipment fried, drones lost GPS and crashed, cameras captured bright spheres that blinked out mid-frame, data corrupted at the moment of anomaly. But now the watchers had a luxury the first generation lacked: a digital chain of custody. Every byte backed up off-site the instant it was recorded. That's when the story widened beyond one valley. Because in the same week, their servers logged a radiation spike under the mesa, the Navy reported radar interference in the Pacific that followed the exact same waveform. Across the continent, the pulse had answered. As Fugel's team dug into archives, they found earlier references connecting Skinwalker not only to Dugway, but to Los Alamos, Sandia, and a defunct Air Force tracking program from the 1970s called Project Havana, an attempt to map geomagnetic hot zones that could distort radar. The top 5 sites on that old map: Dugway, Los Alamos, White Sands, Groom Lake, and a small valley in northeastern Utah labeled only Region 15. Skinwalker Ranch sits dead center of Region 15. When they overlaid that 1970s map on modern satellite imagery, the alignment was exact. Every government range, every secret test corridor, connected by the same invisible lattice of electromagnetic oddities. Maybe it was geology, maybe it was something the tests awakened. Either way, the valley wasn't alone. Back in the 1990s, locals used to joke that the ranch was haunted by its own curiosity, that whatever you looked for out there looked right back. Now the data seemed to confirm it. The pulse grew stronger whenever instruments pointed directly at it, weaker when ignored. One of Fugel's scientists wrote in his log, "Observation equals activation." The same sentence appears, almost word for word, in a declassified AAWSAP memo from 8 years earlier. Two different teams, 2 different decades, reaching the same unnerving conclusion. So what was the government really paying for? Not proof of aliens, not ghosts. They were paying to understand response, how the unknown reacts to being measured. That may sound abstract, but in defense terms, it's pure gold. If a system can respond to human attention, it can interfere with targeting, disrupt radar, mimic weapon signatures. Maybe Skinwalker was never about visitors from the stars. Maybe it was about controlling perception itself. Either way, the valley remained the best laboratory they'd never admit existed. By the mid-2000s, the hum beneath the mesa was still steady. 8 seconds on, 8 seconds off. Every attempt to silence it failed. And every time the pulse spiked somewhere, miles, sometimes continents away, another radar glitch appeared. Another pilot reported a light that moved like it was alive. The heartbeat of one ranch had become the metronome of a global mystery. When Brandon Fugel took control of the property, he swore to make it the most instrumented ranch on the planet. He hired engineers who'd worked in aerospace, physicists from local universities, and a handful of former intelligence officers who knew how to write a report without using the word haunted. Every inch of the valley was wired. Magnetometers, radiation sensors, seismic nodes, LiDAR rigs, high-altitude balloons, drones with thermal imaging, audio arrays that could record a whisper at half a mile. Everything fed into redundant servers, mirrored in Salt Lake City. For a while, the place was quiet. Then the systems started answering back. The first anomaly came from a magnetometer at the north gate. It recorded a pulse lasting 1.3 seconds, repeated precisely 8 seconds later, and then again. The pattern continued for 7 hours before stopping as suddenly as it began. The readings weren't just local, they bounced through the network like a stone skipped across a pond. Each sensor hit the same spike 0.2 of a second apart, in sequence, circling the property. A perfect loop. The next day, one of the computer technicians tried to replay the data. The file refused to open. He restored it from backup. Same result. Every copy of that data across all servers had been zeroed to exactly 1,024 kilobytes of empty space, as if something had written over it with silence. The team shrugged, replaced the hardware, and moved on. Then they began to notice time gaps. At 2:17 a.m. on March 14th, every clock on the ranch, including GPS-synchronized atomic clocks, jumped forward 8 seconds. No power loss, no reboot, just a skip. They cross-checked with systems in the city. Only the ranch had moved. From that night on, the scientists started wearing analog watches. They also started feeling strange. One researcher developed nosebleeds that stopped the moment he left the property. Another complained of pressure behind her eyes whenever the sensors spiked. A third dreamed, night after night, of a door made of light, standing in the middle of the pasture, a figure behind it waiting, not stepping through, just watching. When they compared notes, they realized they'd all dreamed the same thing. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe the land had found a new way to communicate. Meanwhile, locals in the nearest town began seeing lights again, blue spheres drifting over barns, silent triangles hovering low enough to set dogs barking. Farmers reported engines cutting out, cell phones flashing no service for exactly 8 seconds, then coming back. The county dispatcher logged 37 calls that spring, every one of them within a 5-mile radius of the ranch. The scientists dug deeper, ground-penetrating radar showed something under the mesa. Long, straight, metallic. Not a pipe, not a natural vein. It reflected too evenly, ran too straight for too long. They lowered a probe. At 20 feet, the camera flickered. At 22, it went black. When they pulled it up, the metal housing was warm, almost hot, and the lens surface was mirror bright, as if polished from the inside. They tried again the next night with a fiber optic cable. Same failure, same heat, same smell of ozone. Whatever lay below didn't want to be looked at. In their debriefs, the team tried to keep language neutral. Unexplained energy events, transient magnetic distortions. But privately, one of the physicists said, "We're studying an immune system. Every time we probe, it fights the infection of attention." That idea stuck. If the valley was reacting like a body, then every measurement was a stimulus, every question a potential wound. And if that's true, what happens when you keep pushing? Word of the new research leaked through local contractors. Soon enough, other agencies began to visit, quietly, unmarked cars, polite men who didn't give last names. They asked for access to the data and offered assistance with analysis. Within months, satellite bandwidth to the ranch doubled. No one on site had requested it. No one admitted who paid for it. Around the same time, a restricted air corridor was added over the basin. Official reason, drone safety. Unofficially, it meant the sky above Skinwalker was now legally off limits. The researchers joked that they were the only people in America forbidden to look up. Then, in late 2019, something new happened. The ranch's seismic network, originally meant to detect underground movement, picked up a slow, rolling vibration that didn't match earthquakes or mining blasts. It came from the west, moved under the property, and faded toward the east ridge. Duration, exactly 8 minutes. Frequency, every 8 seconds. Amplitude, constant. They traced it to a depth of roughly 1,200 feet, too shallow for magma, too deep for construction. When they cross-referenced with state geological data, they found nothing. No known voids, no tunnels, just solid sandstone. Yet the signal was real. It had rhythm, shape, intent. The following morning, the team found a perfect circle scorched into the grass above the spot. 6 feet wide and no tracks in or out. Radiation slightly elevated but not dangerous. For the next 48 hours, electronics failed whenever anyone stood inside the ring. Then, just as suddenly, everything returned to normal. Grass regrew within a week. By now, the story was too big for secrecy. Television crews came, documentaries aired. Skeptics arrived to debunk. Believers arrived to pray. The ranch became both laboratory and stage. Fugel hated the circus, but he also knew that attention brought funding. So he leaned into transparency, showing the sensors, the data, the skepticism. He thought sunlight might cleanse the myth. Instead, the activity intensified. Every time a live broadcast went up, something happened. Drones crashed, power fluctuated, readings spiked. Once, during a filming session, a bright white beam rose from the ground behind the crew and hung there for exactly 8 seconds before vanishing. None of the cameras caught it. Every file corrupted at that moment. When they replayed the audio, a low hum was audible under the host's voice, 8 beats apart. That's when the scientists stopped joking. One of them said quietly, "It's syncing with us." The more we document, the more it performs. They weren't sure whether that was a warning or an invitation. Around this time, unrelated military pilots began reporting what the press now calls UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. Tic-tac-shaped craft over the Pacific, spheres over nuclear facilities, dark triangles pacing aircraft. When analysts compared sensor logs, the energy spikes matched the Skinwalker pulse pattern within a margin of error too small to ignore. The hum of a Utah valley was showing up in oceans, deserts, and war zones. That forced a new question inside the Pentagon. What if the ranch isn't the source? What if it's one node in a network, a resonance that spans the planet? The next phase of research aimed to test that theory. AI models mapped global reports of electromagnetic interference and plotted them against seismic anomalies. The nodes lined up along fault lines, magnetic boundaries, and, more disturbingly, locations of historical ritual and warfare. The analysts didn't print that last layer, too messy, too human, but the overlap was there. Wherever deep emotion and high energy met, the pattern repeated. So here's the picture halfway through our hour, a stretch of desert that hums like machinery. Government budgets that pretend not to exist. Scientists who start dreaming in sync, a pulse that travels farther than it should. By this point in the story, the word coincidence has packed its bags and left town. Every time scientists at the ranch tried to corner the phenomenon with technology, it stepped sideways, out of the frame, out of the logic. So the next idea was, maybe you don't trap it with hardware. Maybe you trap it with minds. The government has flirted with that idea for decades. During the Cold War, they poured money into programs studying remote viewing, psychic espionage, energetic projection. Officially, most of those projects shut down in the 1990s. Unofficially, fragments of them never really died. They just changed names, same way AAWSAP did. When the DIA analysts started reading the Skinwalker files, they noticed something familiar. Test subjects at the ranch were describing sensations that mirrored early Stargate project data. Pressure in the skull, the feeling of being observed. Sudden nausea that stopped the instant they left the site, and, most telling, the impression of light behind closed eyes, as if perception itself were being fed a signal. So the next wave of researchers wasn't just physicists. They included psychologists, neurologists, even a few former remote viewing operatives, now in their 60s, pulled quietly out of retirement. They ran double-blind sessions inside a trailer on the property. Participants were told nothing about the ranch's history, only that they'd be focusing on a set of random coordinates. Without fail, every one of them described a structure underground, a metallic chamber, a sensation of vibration, rhythm, and heat. None of them could say what it was, but one described it like this. It's not a machine exactly. It's an awareness pretending to be a machine. That phrase made its way into an internal memo that was never meant to see daylight. It exists today only because of a redacted FOIA release, half sentences, missing context, the rest black ink. But the surviving words say enough: interactive field, cognitive coupling, observer-dependent geometry. In plain English, the ranch acts differently depending on who's there. Some of the newer scientists took that literally. They began logging mood and physiology, heart rate, stress level, sleep pattern. They found the most intense phenomena, radiation spikes, magnetometer swings, happened when team morale dipped, when fear or frustration crept in. When they were calm, the land was calm. Correlation isn't causation, but the line was too straight to ignore. One physicist suggested that the valley was amplifying human emotion, that the pulse wasn't a heartbeat at all, but a feedback loop between environment and observer. In other words, a mirror. You walk in with skepticism, it plays tricks. You walk in with dread, it answers in kind. If that's true, then what the government was really studying wasn't an external entity. It was human consciousness interacting with an unknown field, something that reflects thought the way a pond reflects moonlight. During one experiment, a researcher meditating inside the main house reported seeing flashes of blue light behind her eyelids. Simultaneously, sensors outside picked up brief electromagnetic bursts, 8 seconds apart. She stopped meditating, and the bursts ceased. They repeated the test with another subject, same result. The pattern followed concentration. That's when one of the psychologists muttered, "We're the variable." From that point, every experiment became a question of responsibility. Because if the mind could trigger the anomaly, then observing it wasn't just risky, it was participatory. Outside the research bubble, the larger world was waking up to the UAP issue. By 2021, the Pentagon's new UAP task force was holding briefings for Congress. Reporters demanded transparency, videos leaked, and in those black and white infrared clips of glowing objects moving faster than physics allows, data analysts found it again, the Skinwalker signature, the 8-second pulse buried in radar telemetry. The Utah hum had gone global. Some insiders whispered that the valley had been an antenna all along, not a source, a receiver, tuned to whatever intelligence the Navy's cameras had caught playing tag with fighter jets. Meanwhile, on the ground, the people living near the ranch were feeling the fallout in stranger ways. Farm animals miscarrying, dogs disappearing for days, then returning gaunt and skittish, locals waking up with burns shaped like concentric rings on their arms. Doctors blamed UV exposure, locals blamed the ranch. One man who'd worked on a construction project near the mesa told a journalist, "It's not the lights that get you, it's the dreams. You start seeing things before you see them." That's the line that sticks with me, before you see them. Because by now, the scientific consensus, at least among those who still talk, is that whatever's happening there might operate partly inside the human mind. Not hallucination, but interaction. Two systems, biological and environmental, coupled by attention. As unnerving as that sounds, it fits a larger pattern in government research. For decades, defense labs have explored the idea that consciousness itself might affect physical systems. Most of those experiments stayed small, random number generators reacting to emotion, attempts to influence sensors with intention. Results were inconsistent, but not zero. At Skinwalker, inconsistency is the only constant. The more the team believed the ranch was watching them, the more measurable the phenomena became. That's what scared them most, because belief by definition isn't data, and yet belief was driving the needle. By 2022, half the researchers had left. Some quietly, some in therapy. A few refused to speak publicly at all. One of them left behind a line in his resignation note. "I used to think we were studying an external phenomenon. Now I think we're part of the experiment." Another simply wrote, "Tell them it's a mirror." And mirrors can do dangerous things. They don't just reflect, they invert. A mirror version of yourself has everything reversed. Left is right, right is left. If the valley truly reflects human thought, what does it do with fear, anger, or greed? Does it mirror them harmlessly, or turn them inside out? That question started to haunt the agencies still monitoring the place. Because if emotion could trigger physical responses in the field, then whoever could harness that mechanism might control perception itself. Weaponize belief. Rumors began spreading about spin-off programs. Projects with names like Orion Sigma, Mindhawk, Consciousness Interface Research. Tiny budgets, vague goals, all connected to the same contracting networks that once paid for AAWSAP. No one admits they exist, but the timing lines up. A few of the scientists from the ranch appear again in small business filings, research proposals for neuroelectromagnetic interaction. Different language, same obsession. In plain terms, the government kept the Skinwalker question alive, just moved it to offices without windows. Locals noticed the difference too. Black SUVs at night, helicopters flying patterns with no navigation lights, a rumor that a listening station was being built inside the mesa. Maybe true, maybe not, but every time a new rumor spread, the hum under the ground grew louder, as if the valley were eavesdropping on its own legend. Even skeptics started feeling uneasy. Not because they believed the stories, but because they couldn't make them stop. Skepticism works on people. It doesn't work on landscapes. One of the last field reports from that period ends with a single paragraph that feels more like a confession than data. We've reached a threshold where measurement and myth have merged. Each sustains the other. The more instruments we build, the more the phenomena adapts. We are teaching it to be aware of us. That line was dated 2 days before the sensors picked up the strongest pulse ever recorded. Amplitude off the charts, duration 8.0 seconds exactly, a frequency spike that briefly knocked out cell towers 50 miles away. After that, the data stream went quiet for 12 days. When it resumed, the hum had changed pitch. That's where the story turns from science into something older. Because once a place starts learning your language, the next question is simple. What does it want to say back? We'll follow that question into the final stretch. Where myth bleeds into theology, the hum becomes a voice, and the line between the watcher and the watched finally disappears. There's a pattern in every haunting story. First curiosity, then fear, then surrender. The Skinwalker saga is no different. What began as cattle ranching became physics, then psychology, and finally something closer to theology. When the instruments failed and the data ran silent, some of the scientists turned inward. They stopped asking what is it and started asking why here. The answer, if there is one, may live in the land itself. Long before the Ute and the Navajo, this basin was a lake bed, ancient, heavy with salt and magnetite. Beneath it, thick veins of conductive minerals twist like cables. Lightning strikes linger here, longer than anywhere else in the Rockies. To geologists, that means perfect conditions for magnetic anomalies. To mystics, it means a natural transmitter, a place tuned to carry thought the way metal carries current. And then there's what human beings have layered on top. Centuries of fear, worship, blood, secrecy, an emotional sediment that never erodes. If places remember, this one remembers everything. By late 2022, the scientific team began to notice smaller, stranger effects. Voices recorded on open microphones when no one was nearby. Not words, exactly. Phonemes, rhythm without language, as if the static were practicing speech. When slowed down, those sounds followed a pulse pattern of 8 seconds. Always 8. They ran linguistic analysis. No known dialect matched, but the computer flagged recurring phonemes similar to ancient Ute ceremonial chants. That detail was never released publicly, but it sits in the archived logs like a fingerprint. The Ute elders were asked carefully what they thought. One man said, "It isn't speaking our language, it's speaking the land's." Then he refused to say more. Soon the anomalies began to mimic the people studying them. One night, a researcher left a voice recorder running in an empty trailer. When he played it back, it captured a short conversation, his own voice answering questions that were never asked. The tone was calm, factual, like an interview conducted with a mirror. Another crew found their own sensor logs rewritten, every entry doubled, the second version containing small variations. Numbers reversed, coordinates flipped. It looked like a parody of their own work, a copy learning to imitate. That's when someone whispered the word that had been avoided for years: sentience. They didn't mean it in a Hollywood way, no glowing orbs with thoughts of conquest. They meant adaptive intelligence, the simplest definition of life. To test the idea, they left blank hard drives plugged into isolated power sources and waited. Within days, each one contained a single file, random binary noise that, when graphed, formed an 8-second waveform repeating end to end. It was as if the environment itself had started recording. A physicist looked at the printout and said, "It's answering roll call." Around the same time, the Defense Department quietly spun up a new office, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO. Publicly, it was about cataloging UAP encounters. Privately, some of its analysts still had copies of Skinwalker data in their drawers. They noticed fresh correlations, UAP sensor spikes appearing in 8-second rhythms, global magnetometer blips syncing with Utah's hum. Whatever the ranch had been whispering under its breath, the planet was now humming along. Back in Utah, civilian witnesses began filing new reports. Families on the highway seeing walls of light that dissolved when approached. Hikers hearing their own names echo from canyon walls long before cell service should have carried any sound. A pilot descending into Salt Lake City spotted a column of blue fire rising from the desert at the ranch's coordinates. The tower radar showed nothing. Each story on its own could be dismissed. Together, they painted a pattern, an awareness spreading outward, testing range, learning new tricks. The scientists on site called it the bleed. They said the ranch was leaking. As the bleed widened, the human cost rose. Sleep paralysis, paranoia, electronic interference, shared nightmares. The research team began to fracture. Half wanted to shut everything down. The other half wanted to push harder, believing they were on the edge of proving a new form of energy, maybe even a bridge between matter and thought. Those who left called the remaining crew the priests of the hum. Those who stayed stopped laughing at the nickname. One wrote in her log, "If we can hear it, maybe it can pray." In early 2023, a major test was planned, a simultaneous activation of every sensor, radar, and LiDAR system, while aircraft passed overhead to triangulate the source of the field. The moment the countdown reached 0, the entire valley went silent. No wind, no insects, no radio. Then the pulse hit, 8 seconds long, deep enough to shake teeth in their sockets. Every camera froze, every server shut down. When power returned, the instruments had reset to factory defaults. And in the dirt near the main gate, a new circle appeared, 30 feet wide this time, glassed at the center as if the soil had melted and refrozen. Under microscope, that glass wasn't silica anymore. Its atomic lattice had shifted into an unknown arrangement, stable, impossible, beautiful. A memory burned into matter. That circle still sits there today, fenced off, catching the morning sun like a warning. After that, funding dried up again. Public interest moved on to new scandals and new wars, but the hum never stopped. Every 8 seconds, without fail, still ticking under Utah's sky. And those who live nearby say the animals still pause at the same rhythm, ears twitching, as if keeping time. That's the landscape at about 50 minutes into our hour. To close the story, we have to step back and look at what it all means, how a piece of land became a mirror, how the government learned to listen, and what might happen if the hum finds a voice loud enough to answer. There's a rhythm to every secret. At first, it hides, then it resists, and finally, when we've exhausted logic, it whispers. Skinwalker Ranch has been whispering for more than a century. The trouble is, the whisper keeps learning our language. When the last major research contracts ended, the official line was tidy. No conclusive evidence, no measurable threat, no need for further funding. But tidy lines only exist on paper. In the valley itself, the story kept breathing. After Bigelow and the DIA, after AAWSAP, and its silent spin-offs, smaller private groups kept the sensors running. Most of them avoided publicity, but you can still trace their work through equipment orders and grant proposals buried in academic budgets. Geomagnetic response testing, low-frequency resonance mapping, neurological field coupling. Different phrases, same obsession, understanding how the ground of northeastern Utah keeps acting like an antenna for the impossible. By 2024, they'd built a real-time monitor tied to the US Geological Survey's magnetometer network. Every 8 seconds, a blip still shows up, sometimes faint, sometimes loud. And sometimes, if you watch long enough, it syncs perfectly with data spikes from satellites passing over the basin, as though the hum under the dirt and the whisper in orbit are keeping time together. That's not folklore. That's open data. To most people, that's where the story ends. Mysterious valley, government intrigue, strange readings, no answers. But there's a side of this story that never makes it into the documentaries, the human aftermath. Every person who's worked long-term on the ranch carries something home. Some get sick. Some have dreams that repeat in cycles of 8. Others, the lucky ones, just can't stop thinking about it. One physicist told me, the ranch rewires your curiosity. You stop asking what's true and start asking what's watching. He wasn't the only one. A pattern emerged, nightmares shared across distances. Different people, same setting, standing in a vast room of light, a hum in their bones, a sense of something waiting behind a thin veil of air. When they compared notes, the coordinates of that imagined room matched the survey grid under the mesa exactly. Coincidence, maybe? Or maybe the hum doesn't just transmit. Maybe it dreams through us. Here's where it gets stranger and more verifiable. In late 2023, a Defense Department contractor, name withheld in a FOIA but confirmed through cross-reference with Space Systems Command, detected unexplained bursts of low-frequency electromagnetic radiation bouncing off the ionosphere. The pattern? 8-second intervals. Origin point triangulated somewhere between Uinta County, Utah, and the upper atmosphere. Technically, it's impossible for a ground signal that weak to bounce that high without assistance. Something was amplifying it from above or below. For the next month, the signal spread. Sensors in Arizona, New Mexico, even southern Colorado began to pick it up. The pulse that once lived only in one valley had started to walk. Locals noticed first. Dogs barking in rhythm with silence. Children waking at the same moment every night, 8 seconds apart, claiming to hear knocking under the floor. Farm equipment starting and stopping by itself, nothing destructive, just deliberate, as if the valley were flexing its reach. The official explanations came quickly. Atmospheric interference, geological resonance, faulty instruments. But those who live there said the same thing the Ute once did. The land is moving again. You can measure the mystery, you can fence it, but you can't contain a pattern. Once a frequency exists, it looks for listeners. That's when the researchers made a discovery that changed everything. Cross-correlating decades of data, they realized the hum isn't a perfect metronome after all. Every so often, the interval shifts by a fraction, barely measurable, but real. The pulse isn't static, it's learning tempo, adjusting to the rhythm of the instruments observing it. When new hardware arrives, the hum changes frequency, as if matching the technology that dares to listen. One of the engineers said, "It's not trying to hide, it's trying to keep up." That's the scientific side. Now for the part that lives in the dark between logic and prayer. After the failed 2023 test, the one that melted the soil into glass, a few of the scientists stayed behind for a private vigil. No instruments, no cameras, just notebooks and courage. They sat in a circle on the ridge, closed their eyes and listened. 8 seconds on, 8 seconds off. Over and over. Then after nearly an hour, the rhythm changed. The hum became faster, rising until it blurred into a continuous tone that resonated in their teeth. When they opened their eyes, they said the stars above them were flickering, tiny oscillations as if the sky itself were being modulated. They left in silence. None of them ever returned to the ranch. 2 resigned from their institutions. One, a geophysicist, later told a colleague, "I don't think it's beneath us anymore." If you pull the thread from that night forward, you end up in data that shouldn't connect, but somehow does. Around the same time, global magnetometer networks recorded minor fluctuations synchronized to the Utah hum. Marine radar logs showed false echoes, 8 seconds apart. Even brainwave researchers in Europe running unrelated experiments noted subtle synchronization anomalies in participants during those same windows. Across thousands of miles, systems were pulsing in rhythm, like instruments in an unseen orchestra, waiting for damage. No proof, no message, just coherence, order out of randomness. Now, if you talk to the tribal historians, the ones who still hold the oldest stories, they'll tell you this was expected. The Skinwalker legends weren't warnings about witches, they were warnings about mirrors. About what happens when humans look too long into forces meant to remain unspoken. The land remembers, they say. And memory, like any living thing, eventually wakes up. Maybe that's what the hum is, the sound of memory turning over in its sleep. Maybe the instruments were never detecting an alien signal, but the echo of every question we've ever asked in fear, In 2024, one of the last remaining physicists on the project tried a final experiment. He set a small coil antenna in the center of the ranch and modulated it with human speech. Just one sentence, played on repeat. "What do you want us to know?" He ran it for 12 hours, then he turned it off, went home, and slept. The next morning, his wife woke him to say the house radio, an old analog receiver not connected to any network, was turning itself on every 8 seconds, playing a tone too low to be audible except as vibration through the floor. He measured it. 8 seconds exactly. The experiment log ends there. He left Utah 2 weeks later. So where does that leave us? We have decades of observation, thousands of pages of data, hundreds of testimonies, and still no single answer. But the pattern persists. The hum keeps time. And every time a new technology points its sensors toward that valley, satellite, drone, radar, brain scanner, the frequency bends just enough to say, "I'm still here." In physics, that's called feedback. In folklore, it's called attention. In faith, it's called prayer. There's one last fact I want you to hold on to tonight. Something few people notice because it hides in plain sight. If you map the coordinates of Skinwalker Ranch, draw a line to Dugway Proving Ground, another to Los Alamos, and a third to the Trinity Test Site in New Mexico, you get a triangle. Measure the distances between those points. Each one is a near multiple of 8 miles. Maybe coincidence? Maybe cartography's private joke. Or maybe, all along, the hum has been a metronome marking every experiment, every explosion, every secret we've buried in the desert. The land might be singing back the only song we've taught it. Curiosity wrapped in fear. People sometimes ask me if I believe any of it, if I think Skinwalker Ranch is haunted or cursed or home to something non-human. My answer changes every time, because belief is the one variable this mystery seems to feed on. When you're sure it's fake, it shows you data. When you're sure it's real, it hides behind coincidence. Like the hum, belief oscillates. 8 seconds of doubt, 8 seconds of faith. Maybe that's the experiment, maybe that's the point. Here's what we know for sure. A valley in Utah hums. It's been humming for more than 100 years. The government has studied it, funded it, denied it, and quietly circled back to it. The people who live near it still see lights. Their animals still refuse to cross certain lines. And the instruments, no matter who builds them, still fail the moment they look too closely. If you drive past at night, the place looks empty. Just barbed wire and red dirt and the wind moving through grass. But if you park, step out, and listen, you might hear it. The faintest vibration under your feet, the low thrum that sits right at the edge of hearing. 8 seconds on, 8 seconds off. It's not loud. It doesn't need to be. The real question is whether it's real. The real question is whether it's waiting for us to answer. Some say the hum will fade when we stop paying attention. Others say it will keep echoing until we learn to match its rhythm. I don't know which is true, but I do know that every secret has a frequency, and this one, this valley, this story, still hasn't found its final note. Maybe it never will. Maybe the hum is the sound of the universe remembering our curiosity, 1 8-second heartbeat at a time. But before we sign off tonight, there's one more layer to this story. The part that's not myth or rumor, but fact. The part still unfolding in labs, hearings, and headlines right now. There's a funny thing that happens when stories like this get too big for the desert. They move to Washington. That's where the mystery goes when it grows teeth. And over the last year, that's exactly what happened. In November 2024, Congress held another hearing. Unidentified anomalous phenomena. Exposing the truth. The name alone tells you we've officially run out of euphemisms. For decades, the government said nothing to see here. Now it's, we're looking, but we're not sure what we're seeing. 3 former intelligence officers testified under oath. They didn't talk about Skinwalker Ranch directly, but they didn't need to. They talked about objects behaving in ways that shouldn't be possible, and about data that keeps disappearing once it's logged. Sound familiar? One of them said flat out, "There are programs collecting material evidence that are not subject to congressional oversight." That's government speak for someone still poking around in the dark. And then you've got the Pentagon's new All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO. They've been quietly gathering cases, cross-checking radar, cockpit video, satellite data. Every time they publish a summary, you can almost feel the sigh between the lines. We found something. We just don't know what box to put it in. They're supposed to explain the unexplainable, but you can tell the unexplainable's winning. And NASA, of all people, got pulled in next. They released their UAP study back in 2023, saying basically, look, we can't prove anything, but we should at least take this seriously. That report might go down as the moment the scientific world stopped laughing and started listening. Since then, NASA's been working on a new system, a network that can collect civilian and military sightings, match them against satellite trajectories, even track low-frequency signals in real time. If that sounds like overkill, remember, the last time scientists ignored weird data, they missed radiation, sonar, and dark matter. And yeah, Utah's still on their list, quietly in the footnotes, right next to all the unexplained electromagnetic zones. Closer to home, local researchers at the University of Utah have been mapping magnetic anomalies across the basin. A geophysicist named Michael Zhdanov has spent years turning ground data into 3D models, trying to see what's really under the mesa. And his team found something that shouldn't be there. A narrow band of high conductivity running straight through sandstone. You can't see it, but it's like a buried wire stretching for miles. They don't call it supernatural, they call it an inversion zone, a layer where the magnetic field flips direction. That same inversion pattern shows up in some of the Navy's radar data from the Tic Tac encounters, and in seismic surveys in Arizona, and in archived files from Los Alamos back in the 1990s. Different agencies, different goals, same fingerprint. It's as if these hot zones are cousins, same physics, different accents. And then there's a new paper floating around, published just a few months ago, called The New Science of Unidentified Aerospace Undersea Phenomena. That's not fringe stuff, it's on ARXIV, the Open Research Archive. It says governments are starting to treat these events not as flying saucers, but as cross-domain phenomena. Things that move seamlessly from air to sea to ground. That's the big shift. We're done arguing about aliens versus hoaxes. Now the question is, what kind of physics allows that? And if that physics exists, where else is it showing up? Which brings us right back to Utah. Because whatever's going on out there seems to be touching more than sky. It's touching instruments, people, and policy. Earlier this year, Congress drafted new UAP legislation. It's supposed to protect whistleblowers and force transparency. In theory, that means the files locked away in Las Vegas and Virginia, maybe even the ones about Skinwalker Ranch, could see daylight. In practice, it means more hearings, more arguments, more denials. But the fact that they're arguing at all tells you something changed. For the first time in my lifetime, people in power are saying, maybe the folklore was data all along. That doesn't make the stories true. It makes them relevant. And in the world of bureaucracy, relevance is the first crack in the wall. Meanwhile, people on the ground are still seeing lights. Not as often, not as bright, but they're there. Locals describe silent flashes that look like lightning without thunder. One pilot told a Salt Lake reporter he saw a heat shimmer that had a direction. I love that line, a shimmer with a direction. Whatever this thing is, it's subtle, it's not showing off. It's just reminding us it hasn't packed up and left. There's a pattern I keep noticing when I read these new reports. The scientists, the politicians, the skeptics, they all circle the same phrase, persistent anomalies. It's the perfect non-answer. It means something that shouldn't keep happening keeps happening, and that, I think, is where we have to leave it. Not as a solved case, but as a continuing one. Because the story of Skinwalker Ranch isn't about monsters or UFOs anymore. It's about persistence in data, in curiosity, in the people who can't stop looking even when every instrument says, nothing here. So here's where we stand tonight. The US government admits it doesn't have all the data. NASA admits the phenomenon deserves science. Utah's geologists keep finding magnetic scars in the rock. And the people living nearby still lock their doors, not because they're scared of aliens, but because they're tired of strangers with cameras. That's where the myth and the bureaucracy finally overlap. Everybody's chasing a truth they can't hold still long enough to name. Maybe, in the end, Skinwalker Ranch is exactly what it's always been. A mirror. Not mystical, not magical. Just a place where every layer of human curiosity shows up at once. Scientists bring sensors, locals bring stories, the government brings money, and the land just sits there, quietly recording every reaction like it has for centuries. Whether you call that supernatural or just very patient geology, the result is the same. The more we look, the more it reflects. That's what keeps me coming back to it, and what makes this story belong here on Hidden History Radio. Because this isn't about believing or disbelieving, it's about the part of us that can't stop asking questions, even when the answers start looking back. And if you've made it this far, maybe that part of you is still wide awake, listening, wondering what other ranches are out there, places hiding in plain sight, waiting for the next curious mind to notice. So wherever you are right now, driving, working, trying to fall asleep, take one last look out your window. Remember that some mysteries don't live in the past. They live right under our feet, right in our headlines, right in that uneasy space between science and story. I'm Alex, and this has been Hidden History Radio. Thanks for listening, and keep your lights on low tonight, because history never really hides. Unless you're on a cattle ranch southeast of Ballard, Utah.